Very briefly, I'm going to talk about my own interest in climate change, looking at two current and projected changes in temperature and precipitation in Peterborough and the Kawarthas. I'll look at how local nature is changing, what the likely future impacts are going to be, why all of this matters, of course, and what we can do, where we can find inspiration. So just a few pictures there. Okay. There we go. Fine, thanks. So I've had a lifelong interest in nature, as you can see by the black and white photo there, all the way back in 1964. And this interest eventually led to a book I published in 2002 called Nature's Year in the Kawarthas. And it's sort of an almanac of what to expect in nature each month of the year, when specific events are happening, when birds are coming back, when trees are leafing out, flowers blooming, all that kind of thing. So researching the book really gave me a good idea of when things normally happen. So when the frogs start calling, like the spring peepers, for example. So a real sense of what sort of the long-term normal has been over, in the past. I've also been an active member of the For Our Grandchildren Climate Action Group, really since its inception. I've kept a temperature almanac, monthly temperatures going back 11 years. So I can compare those temperatures to the longer-term average. And I'm a father and grandfather too, and I have to say that I am concerned about their future. So a lot of inspiration in my case coming from that fact. Okay. So on the right here, we're looking at my temperature almanac from April 22nd all the way back to January of 2021. Essentially, Peterborough has warmed by about 1.5 degrees Celsius over the previous decades, most of this warming happening just in the last 10 years. The planet as a whole has warmed by about 1.1 Celsius, and Canada by about 1.7. The warming, of course, is much greater in the Arctic than it is in southern Canada. So what have I noticed? Well, since 2010, there have been almost exactly twice as many warmer than average months as opposed to cooler than average months. And the warmer than average months, by and large, have been much warmer than the norm, whereas colder than average have been very close to the average. So what's really jumping out is just how much warmer so many months have been. And so if we look at the chart here, we can see, looking back over 2021, you can see that March was 2.6 degrees warmer, August an amazing 2.8 degrees warmer. And for that type of warmth, you have to have really warm days and also warm nights. 2.8 doesn't look like a big number, but it reflects a huge departure from the norm in daily highs. And October just blew me away by how much warmer it was, 5 degrees Celsius. Now that is almost unprecedented. And you may remember just how warm Thanksgiving weekend was. It was really quite extraordinary. December too was incredibly warm. Now we did have a cooler January, quite a bit cooler, but scientists think that these severe winter colds may have something to do with changes in the jet stream that themselves are related to a warming Arctic. So a lot of active research being done there. The days above 30 degrees Celsius too are increasing in the summer. We had 35 days in 2020 compared to only 10 on average in the 1990s. We didn't get frost until late October, a full month later. And yeah, so as I've mentioned, as the climate warms, extreme cold is still possible. So that extreme cold does not disprove that the climate is warming locally. Okay. So here are some projections that have been done for Peterborough. These were done in a report submitted to the city in 2020. And these projections are based on a business as usual emission scenario. And that's definitely what we're in. We're still in business as usual. In fact, emissions, I believe, may still be climbing to some degree. So in terms of annual mean temperature, baseline of 6.5, expected to increase to 8.6 in the 2030s and up to almost 11 degrees Celsius in the 2060s. So, you know, that's getting close to almost a doubling by then. Big increase in days above 30 degrees Celsius. The greatest warming will be in the winter months. A much longer growing season, of course. We can expect wetter winters and springs, probably slightly drier summers, but definitely more days with extremely heavy precipitation. And the winters, we expect to see a lot more rain instead of snow and more melting of the snowpack between snowfalls. So the takeaway here, sort of the, you might almost call it the elevator pitch explanation as to what's happening. The current climate of southern Pennsylvania is going to become the climate of the Kawarthas in the coming decades. Okay. So all of this means extreme weather. You know, as the temperature rises, the atmosphere contains more water, so we get these flooding events that we've seen in Ontario and Peterborough, 2002 and 2004. But we're also seeing very severe windstorms, the loss of a lot of iconic Peterborough trees. And in recent years, too, we've seen some pretty severe droughts. A shot of Jackson Creek just last June there in the lower left. Okay. So some really interesting, pretty hard-clad proof of what's going on is if you look at the, if you look at when the lakes are freezing up and when the ice is going out. And we're fortunate enough to have data from Bridgenorth, from the Bridgenorth Pharmacy. This is just amazing, going all the way back into the 1860s. So they've recorded when the ice went out over that time frame. So basically what's happening is the ice is going out on average about 2 weeks earlier on Chemung Lake, and this is true for the other Kawartha lakes. So going out in early April, 2 weeks earlier than it was going back essentially 100 years ago. So in the 1880s, the ice was going out about the 110th day of the year, April 20th. By the 1960s, it was going out essentially a week earlier. And now, on average, it's going out 2 weeks earlier, about the 95th day of the year. And at the same time, freeze up is about 2 weeks later. So pretty solid data there that things are warming up. Okay. So nature, of course, is responding, and we're seeing a number of things happening. But maybe the most significant thing is that there's this very interesting northward expansion of southern species. So these are species that used to be limited to, let's say, the north shore of Lake Erie, way down in extreme southwestern Ontario. So now the Kawarthas is home to things like the giant swallowtail butterfly, Canada's biggest butterfly, never seen here before until about 10 or 15 years ago, Red-bellied woodpeckers, same thing. They've become quite common. Hooded warblers, even Virginia opossums. You know, the opossum is sort of an iconic southern species. Well, they're here in Peterborough. Bobcats are showing up too, southern flying squirrels. So a lot of the work done around bobcats and flying squirrels happened at Trent University, research done by Dr. Jeff Bowman. So what he has documented is the northern spread of southern flying squirrels, as a species native to the US. So they've been moving north, and as they've moved north, they've hybridized with our native northern flying squirrel. Lynx too, which have never been common in Peterborough County, but certainly were recorded in the past. They too are retreating northward and being replaced by bobcats, a much more southern species. And it's even happening with mice. White-footed mice are spreading north here and having quite an impact on our resident population of deer mice. But, you know, this is not, it's not just a warming climate. There's a number of other factors involved too. So I always tell people the best way to think of climate change is as an intensifier and sort of an exasperator of a host of other factors. So amplifying the impact of other factors in addition to just the warming. So at the same time as southern species are moving north, which is, you know, I guess you could think of it as a good thing. It's increasing our biodiversity. But the other side of the coin is that we are losing species such as the gray jay or the Canada jay and the moose. You know, these jays used to be a pretty regular occurrence up north of Stony Lake in the petroglyphs in the Apsley area. But because of generally warmer winters, they're having a lot of trouble reproducing. The food that they cache in the fall to feed to their young, these birds actually nest. They're on their eggs by the end of February. The food is spoiling, so they do not have the food base to feed their babies. As for moose, still, you know, relatively common, the northern edge of the county. They're up against a whole bunch of things, an infestation called winter tick. These ticks cover their body and sap away energy. As deer move further north and their population expands, deer or moose are getting infected by brainworm. Brainworm is a parasite that deer carry. It doesn't kill the deer, but it does kill moose. And just the very extreme summer heat events are forcing moose to spend a lot more time just sort of hunkered down in the shade instead of feeding. So they're not putting on the weight and the fat that they normally would. Okay, we've talked about the lynx already. So so what I've really noted personally, you know, when I'm out bird watching or, you know, going out in the spring to listen to the frog chorus, checking out wildflowers, it's just how much earlier things like the spring fall chorus are on average occurring. So one M&R study showed that they are now calling this. When I say calling, I mean the frog chorus. You may have heard spring peepers calling in the spring. It's an absolutely beautiful sound. Well, that is happening on average 10 to 20 days earlier. Same with the blooming of wildflowers like trilliums and shrubs like lilac. Some birds like tree swallows are nesting earlier. Some of the migrant birds that are gone in the winter but come back early in the spring from the southern US, like red-winged blackbirds, are arriving earlier. And you know, you might think, well, what difference does it make if they arrive earlier? Well, the problem is there could be a real mismatch between when birds arrive and lay eggs and have babies, and when their food resources are at their peak. So when birds come back from the tropics, things like orioles and warblers, you may be familiar with warblers, it's timed perfectly so they arrive here when insect numbers are at their peak, especially caterpillars. So if we get really warm Aprils, the leaves are going to come out, the caterpillars are going to come out to eat the leaves, but the warblers won't be back yet because they don't come back until mid-May. So the fear is that they'll get back and there just won't be the food base for them to be feeding their young. And this is already being seen in parts of Europe. Now, there's a caveat here that I feel I have to at least mention. We have had really cold springs in recent years, much colder Aprils than average. And once again, the thinking is that this could be related to changes in the jet stream, allowing Arctic air to pour south in the spring. And these changes are being linked to a warming Arctic, changing the temperature gradient between the Arctic and the temperate zone. So this is still active research, but that may be what's going on, okay? On average, events too are happening later in the fall, later frosts. We didn't have a frost until late October this year, a full month later than usual. In parts of New England, where there's been a lot of work done, peak color is now happening about a week later. And I've certainly noticed that here too, that the trees are not reaching their color height until later. And some falls, when it's been really warm, the heat just seems to completely diminish the intensity of the color. So you see a picture in the upper right there, September 5th, 2017. Shows just what this heat can do to the fall color. We have some birds too that are departing, heading south a little bit later. And also, with open water, many winters, we have waterfowl like trumpeter swans that are actually spending the winter here, and that never used to be the case. So all of these are signs of how climate change is impacting nature in the fall. I'm just going to have a little swig of water. So as the climate warms, of course, we are seeing a longer growing season. But the reason it is warming, of course, is because there's more CO2 in the air. The parts per million CO2 is now at a record height at 420 parts per million. It hasn't been this high for millions of years. So this is how it's affecting plants. Plants like ragweed, for example, are absolutely thriving, as is poison ivy, because they respond more to higher CO2 levels than most other plants do. Ragweed pollen production, you can see the very nasty ragweed pollen there in the upper left. The production of ragweed pollen has more than doubled in many parts of Canada. And its growing season has increased by up to 25 days in many areas, including Toronto. So I'm one who suffers from a hay fever caused by ragweed pollen. And this past fall, was just brutal for me. And the longer growing season and higher CO2 also really seems to be favoring the growth and spread of invasive species. These species thrive on higher CO2. Not all plants do. There's different types of photosynthesis mechanisms, but the invasive species just love this high CO2. So I'm sure you've noticed Phragmites around roadsides. That's that super tall grass-looking reed. It's actually a reed. And you may have seen garlic mustard, maybe in your own backyard. Dog strangling vine too is rampant throughout the Kawartha, southern Kawarthas now. Okay. Another very telling example is the northward spread of black-legged ticks. So these are the ticks that carry Lyme disease. And these ticks were completely absent in the Kawarthas until the early 2000s. And they are now well established. Luckily, most of them don't seem to be carrying the Lyme disease bacteria as of yet, but that may change. The maps in the middle show how the tick populations are expected to increase just over the near future, 2021 to 2050, reaching up to Algonquin Park and beyond. And by the far future, post 2051, almost spreading up to James Bay. So that's quite amazing. And the other piece to this is the animals that actually harbor the bacteria. It's a bit of a complicated life cycle, but the ticks actually feed on large mammals such as deer, and that's where they pick up the bacteria. So as the climate warms, species such as deer are exploding in numbers. So that means the ticks are coming into contact with them more and picking up more of the bacteria and potentially transmitting it to humans. Okay. Another phenomenon that's happening with at least some of the insect populations here is a pretty remarkable decline, especially noticeable in some of the beetles, moths, bumblebees. There's a bunch of different kinds of bumblebees. There's bumblebees now that have totally disappeared from the Kawarthas. And also on monarchs. And this decline is really not very well understood, but there was just a report that came out this week that is linking it pretty confidently to pesticide use, to intensive agriculture, these huge fields of soy and corn that we see in the Kawarthas now. Gone are the hedgerows, gone are a lot of the woodlots, so there's just less and less habitat for insects. But now they feel that that climate change is really having an impact. Climate change causes droughts, which hit insects hard. These cold, abnormally cold springs too kill a lot of insects directly, especially when they come after, or when the cold comes after the insects have hatched out. And maybe one of the most telling things for me has been, you may have heard of this phenomenon called the windshield phenomenon. When I was a kid and a young adult, even going back just maybe 30 years, that's even for me. That's not even for you guys, but you'd come home from a drive in the country, your windshield would look like that windshield in the upper left, just because there were so many flying insects, especially moths. Well, when I come home now after a night out driving around, I'd be lucky if I have one dead insect on the windshield. So your parents and your grandparents, I'm sure, will remember just how gummed up windshields used to be. And just a few quick words about monarchs and climate change. Drought and intense heat on the breeding grounds, such as here in the Kawarthas, has made reproduction more difficult many years. And even during migration, when they're migrating northward, if there's drought happening, they don't have the milkweed to lay their eggs on. They only lay eggs on milkweed. And when they're heading back in the fall, if they encounter drought conditions, there are not the wildflowers for them to nectar on, to get nectar to, fuel the migration. And there's also been a lot of very intense storms and overly warm temperatures on their Mexican wintering grounds, high in the mountains of Michoacan province near Mexico City. And this interrupts their diapause, which is a form of hibernation. So they become active in midwinter rather than in late winter, and are not in the greatest of shape when they turn to migrate north again. Okay. So I realize that I'm painting somewhat of a disconcerting picture here, but I just want to remind everybody that right now, the Kawarthas is still an amazing, amazing area for nature, for biodiversity. It's one of the richest areas in Ontario. So don't get the idea that you know, there's nothing of interest to be found anymore. There certainly is, and you know, people can routinely find 240 types of birds in 1 year just in Peterborough County. So we live in a very, very rich area, and there's so much to enjoy. So that's, you know, that by getting to know nature, you're going to feel compelled to want to protect it and take action on things like climate change. So that's why I'm always encouraging people to get to know local nature, to get out there and get a sense of what we have and what potentially we could lose. So hopefully these future concerns will not become a reality, but if we carry on the same path, the same emission scenarios, we could see the loss of some iconic species, even at 1.5 degrees of warming. So this is research done by the Audubon Society in the US. That's the biggest conservation group in the US. So they're saying at 1.5 degrees of warming, Central Ontario could lose species such as the common loon. Now that would be such a shame. You know, the loon is like such an iconic bird. And birds that are very well known to naturalists, bird watchers like the white-throated sparrow, warblers, woodpeckers like the sapsucker. We have already lost about a third of our birds since 1970, and that's been primarily because of habitat loss, window collisions, which take a terrible toll on birds, and also cats, free-roaming cats. So if you have a cat, keep it in the house because they just do untold damage to bird populations. A lot of these birds, the range is going to contract northward. They're not expected to go extinct. It's just that we won't see them locally. And of course, you know, all of this, the warming is going to impact forests and wetlands and lakes. The intense heat, the drought, the ice, the windstorms are really hard on forests. So many insect pests that have arrived recently or have always been here are thriving in the milder winters. The eggs are not being killed by the cold. The trees are up against competition with invasive species, a host of things going on. So the fear is that, according to MNR research, Ministry of Natural Resources, that we may no longer have the temperature regime and the precipitation regime for the kind of forest we're seeing now. That is a forest dominated by sugar maples and white pines. Those species could disappear from this area, and potentially as early as mid-century. And similar things happening with wetlands too, changes in hydrology, that is things like droughts and floods. Invasive species are really going to hit the wetlands hard. And it's really important to remember that forests and wetlands sequester or lock in or absorb so much carbon dioxide. And they also provide so much protection from floods. So it's really important that we do everything we can to conserve them, especially to conserve existing wetlands and forests. Planting trees can help, but the big thing is to conserve what we have now. Okay. Next slide.
I'm trying. It doesn't want to go.
Okay.
There we go. Did it go too far?
We did go too far. One more.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay. So if we look at our lakes and rivers, and certainly the Kawartha is synonymous with cottaging and spending time on the lakes, and our lakes are still wonderful and they're still in pretty good shape. But there are concerns, obviously. It's predicted that the maximum surface temperature is going to increase by about 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the 2050s. So essentially going from maybe 78 Fahrenheit to 88 Fahrenheit. For some reason, a lot of us still refer to water temperature in Fahrenheit. I'll let you do the conversions into Celsius, but it's, the water temperature is warming up. As I've mentioned too, earlier ice out is happening. Warmer water will mean greater evaporation and lower water levels as that water evaporates, and this sets up great conditions for algae blooms, like we see there in the lower middle slide. Very less or more dangerous, maybe be the way to say it, ice conditions. Getting out on the ice is going to be slushy, and making snowmobiling, for example, a little more hazardous. Increased invasive species like invasive fish like zebra mussels, and a decline in cold and cool water fish like lake trout and brook trout. Lake trout are still a major game species in the northern Kawarthas, and also walleye. Walleye don't do well in warm water. Bass, however, do well and probably will continue to thrive. Okay. So the question, I guess, is why does this matter? All of these things happening in nature. Well, as I'm sure you can guess, it's not just about nature. The changes we're seeing are really the canary in the coal mine of just much bigger threats coming our way. The kind of climate chaos that we saw in British Columbia last year and are seeing right now in Africa. Africa is getting hit so hard by climate change, and it often doesn't even make it to the headlines. So, this is all about preserving a healthy, climate-safe world that's rich in biodiversity. And it's even about protecting our mental and, of course, our physical health. Air pollution from fossil fuel emissions takes a terrible toll on people. And the heat and the loss of nature, too, has a psychological impact. So, this is serious stuff. But by containing climate change, we're going to help safeguard what are called ecosystem services on which human life depends. We depend on the ecosystems, on nature for food and water, for medicines, pollination, water purification, flood control, creating soils, controlling erosion, disease and pest control, and of course, habitat for wildlife, storing carbon. About a quarter of all the emissions are locked up in our forests and wetlands every year. And regulating the climate. We need nature to regulate the climate. Otherwise, things spin out of control. And nature also provides cultural services, a sense of place. When I'm out in the Kawarthas, I have a sense of place that I see in the loons and the maple trees and the pines. So it's beauty, it's inspiration, it's spiritual connection, it's knowledge and learning, just the joy of learning, being out in nature. It's tourism. And I think for many people, especially, not just, but especially Indigenous people, it's identity. So, this stuff matters. So what can you do? A $1 million question. 1 second. All of the research in climate communication now is really pointing to one thing as being by far the most important, and that is talking about climate change with your friends, with your family, with your neighbors, online too, of course, on TikTok or whatever platform you're using, because by and large, those conversations are not happening. You know, we talk ourselves blue in the face about COVID, but for some reason, no one will bring up the topic of climate change, which is a much bigger threat. So that has to change. And you need to try to connect with people emotionally. You don't want to get into the weeds around the science, but talking about things like how it's affecting your hopes and dreams, fears you may feel, but also the exciting solutions and initiatives that are underway, you know, giving people hope, because there's lots of reasons for hope. As I've mentioned, the importance of spending time in nature, getting to know our local plants and animals, maybe taking part in citizen science projects like iNaturalist. This is an amazing app you can download for free that will identify everything you come across in nature, essentially. And it is just an amazing app. And all of this information gets logged in a central database and gives scientists a huge amount of data to work with when they're, you know, designing, or managers are designing conservation projects. This, believe me, if you have any interest in nature at all, iNaturalist will get you totally hooked. One thing you can do too, something I've started doing lately, is sharing carbon dioxide levels. You can actually go to co2.earth and see the latest levels. So there's the latest levels in the upper right from the week of April 10th to 16th, where we hit an all-time high of 420.16 parts per million. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, we were at 280. And 50% of the carbon dioxide that's been pushing this up has been just in the last 30 years, since we knew exactly what the problem was and how to fix it. We've just ignored it. So more carbon dioxide means more global heating and more climate chaos ahead. So you can actually get a little widget for a website that you may have some influence on, or maybe you have your own, that will, this live widget will update automatically. Right now, can you go back? I'm almost at the end. It's so important now to have conversations about voting. You know, getting your parents, your grandparents, friends of yours that are maybe are old enough to vote, to really vote with climate and protection of nature top of mind, because really it's government policy that is going to, you know, is going to make a difference. It's not individual action. As much as individual is important and it keeps you going, and I do everything I can, it gives me energy, but we really need to focus on collective action and getting governments to provide the best policy possible. So look at what the provincial parties are offering right now, and make your mind up. Who's got the best climate program? And try to influence how people vote. It's so important. And demonstrating too is important. So, reasons for hope, you know, there's just so much going on in Peterborough and the Kawartha. It just inspires me to no end. So many groups that are active in conservation and action on climate change. Camp Kawartha, for our grandchildren climate group, which is not just grandparents by any means, despite the name. Pathway to Stewardship, a wonderful environmental education program, the Green Up, Peterborough Green Up Ecology Park, Autonomy Conservation, Kawartha Land Trust, Nature Conservancy of Canada, wonderful organizations. Nature Conservancy just received a donation of 12,000 acres near Bancroft, which is incredible. It's part of a 60,000 acre parcel that's being protected. I get inspiration too from government policy. Even our new official plan in Peterborough has got a lot of really good climate initiatives in it. We have a very aggressive climate or carbon tax in Canada, probably the most aggressive in the world. And I'm quite hopeful too. You may be aware that the Liberals and the NDP federally have formed an alliance, and that's going to allow them to pass a whole bunch of really good climate policies. So And one thing that's really changed in recent years is just the leadership that so many media have taken on. Climate change was something they completely ignored, I would say, until maybe 4 years ago. And now climate change is everywhere, on CBC, in newspapers like the Globe and Mail, Peterborough Examiner. The Globe and Mail, you can read it online, features climate change stories every single day of the week. And the Peterborough Examiner is doing a really good job too. And all kinds of wonderful podcasts too to listen to. There's a whole bunch on climate. My favorite is the CBC podcast called What on Earth with Laura Lynch. Okay. So to conclude, a few things to remember, that with emissions continuing the way they are right now, we have a climate similar to that of southern Pennsylvania coming our way. Southern species are moving north into the Kawarthas, and some of our local species are leaving and retreating northward. A host of events are happening in nature earlier in the spring and others later in the fall. We have an increase in invasive species, poison ivy, ragweed, ticks because of the warming weather and the higher CO2. Pollen levels are climbing, the pollen season is longer. And our forests, wetlands, lakes, and rivers are already suffering and remain extremely vulnerable to climate change. But, there's so much that we as individuals can do, and people really listen to young people. You guys have much more impact than old guys like I do. When you guys talk, when you take action, people listen. They're inspired by young people. So you really need to do what you can as individuals, and take inspiration. So when I say individuals, I'm talking about what you can to inspire collective action, group action, government action, and take inspiration from all that's happening, because there's a lot going on. Thank you.
Hi, Drew. Thank you so much for such an informative session. I like that we highlighted all the things that we can do moving forward, because we've certainly done a lot in the past, and we can definitely make a change that will impact our future. So that was great. Thank you. Miss Vala's class, does anybody have any questions?
Hi, Drew and Jamie. Thanks very much for the presentation. Does anyone have a question? I have a few comments that I just wanted to share with you. I was partway through your presentation, I was getting prepared to ask the question about what you do to maintain your climate optimism. But I really think you answered that toward the end of the presentation. So your political involvement and your activism.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to tell you the reason we were late. First of all, apologize for being late this morning. We were participating in the Mayor's Community Cleanup Challenge. So we were outside picking garbage at King Edward Park.
Good for you. Good for you.
And my class, the class that I have, I just met them yesterday because we started a new quadmester. And what they don't know yet is that they're going to be studying the provincial party platforms on climate change and voting in Ontario Student Vote student election. So this class is going to
wonderful to hear.
Yeah, this class is organizing it for the school. They don't know that. They've also jumped in with both feet in implementing a new recycling program at our school. So
wonderful.
So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you, and I really wanted to thank you. But I do understand it is difficult to know how much you know and not get discouraged, right?
When going back to how I maintain whatever the drive or hope, I think hope is kind of a misused words. I don't think of hope as just sort of sitting idly by and thinking everything's going to turn out okay. I think of hope as something that you generate by taking action. That's where I get my hope, by being active, by doing what I can to influence other people, through my column or books or online. I engage, I engage with people online on climate change, and I get very little pushback. You'd be surprised. But think of hope as something that you generate by taking action. That's the best way to frame hope. Hope is not just sitting back and thinking, oh, you know what, things are going to be okay. So that's a really good way to think about hope.